The first of the Spring 2019 Professional Development Lecture Series. Tonight's special guest is Dr. Suzanne Balch Lindsay, one of my favorite people in the world, and she is going to give a fascinating presentation on Wilkes and Liberty, sedition, freedom of the press, and lessons for America's founding fathers. As always with our professional development lectures, we'll have fascinating information. There will be a time for questions at the end, and then we'll have snacks when it's all said and done. So without further ado, I turn this over to Dr. Suzanne Balch Lindsay.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I thought I might preface before I begin talking with a bit of background about how on earth I came to be interested in what I'm going to share with you this evening. I was 11 years old, actually 10 years old, in 1972 when there was a rather interesting criminal at a place called the Watergate Office Building and Hotel in Washington, D.C. When most other enterprising 10-year-olds are out riding their bikes and hanging out with their friends, noticing that there were some odd and interesting things happening in Washington. And that because it was a presidential election year, I became fascinated watching as a third-rate burglary, as I believe the press secretary to the incumbent president at the time called it, Richard Milhous Nixon, turned into a not-so-third-rate action. And for the next 2 years, when my friends were out lollygagging in the summer, riding bikes and eating, ice cream cones and chasing butterflies and fireflies, I was inside riveted to the television watching first a set of Senate hearings to unravel what was going on, and then the next summer impeachment hearings to determine whether the President of the United States had committed acts of high crimes and misdemeanors that would justify his removal from office. This makes me an incredible nerd, but it led to a lifelong and abiding desire to be one of two things when I grew up. I wanted to be a combination of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward and become an investigative journalist until I figured out you had to talk to live people. And I am a high-functioning introvert, and I don't really want to talk to live people because I get shy and nervous and talk too much and gesticulate too much with my hands and talk in run-on sentences, in case you haven't already figured that part out. And I'm in a room of friends here, so you know how bad this is. The second abiding interest, though, came from watching the hearings, and it was watching not the principals. It was watching those rows of people behind them who would come in with stacks of papers and hand to the questioners on the committee. It was the lawyers who had been investigating and following the story and following the events as they unfolded, evaluating the evidence, trying to determine if crimes had been committed, what crimes those were, who had committed them, and following basically that form of investigation that's done basically by someone skilled in the law. So, investigative journalist who doesn't really like the idea of going out and talking to people that she doesn't know very well and having to introduce myself and be personable and get questions answered, or someone who could study the law and ultimately be able in some ways to undertake the same role, but do it from more standing back and evaluating the truth or lie of the evidence as it unfolded. Once I got to college, and I was a pre-law major, I realized that being a lawyer meant you would have to hang around with other lawyers. I didn't want to practice courtroom law. I always wanted to practice constitutional law because that at core was what had enchanted me and had perplexed me watching as a 10, 11, and 12-year-old. This whole national saga was the U.S. Constitution, its origins, the way that it applies in our particular form of government, and that ultimately led me to history, which led me to ultimately major at the undergraduate level in history, and then to pursue my master's in history and my PhD in history. And during that saga, I discovered that everything I was curious about had its origins elsewhere. That the Americans practiced what has always been our greatest trait, the trait of adaptation, of taking ideas and cultures and amalgamating them and finding ways to create new interpretations that help make us who we are. And that led me primarily to British history, because British and American law are so closely linked, to the point where in American court precedent to this day, you often will see cited, especially at the appellate level, either at the federal appellate courts or even state appellate courts and the national ultimate court, the Supreme Court, and state Supreme Courts, English cases from as far back as the 1200s being cited as precedent for issues that we are still dealing with today. So, my area of expertise, I became an historian rather than a lawyer, and my area of expertise is legal and administrative law. That way I got to have all of my cake and got to eat it too. And get to sit in air-conditioned archives reading the words and thoughts and dreams and hopes of a lot of old people who are dead, but I don't have to talk to them. I can talk to them through their own words. So that's why I did what I did. And my major interests for what I'm going to speak about tonight, I think directly relate to those early years when I was a preteen, foregoing watching soap operas because I wanted to get the gavel coverage of the Irwin hearings. And my grandmother, who I stayed with each summer, complained bitterly because they canceled all of her soaps for this silliness. And I'm sitting there like this the entire time, going, what is Butterfield going to say? But anyway, so set the stage. We have a chief executive who'd taken office a few years previously, who was a polarizing figure. He was an outsider who challenged the traditional model of relationships between his branch of government and the powers of a bicameral legislature. He was, his critics and friends agreed, sensitive to criticism, especially from political opponents and a press that he defined as too radical, too liberal, too biased, and on top of that, they were liars. Fake news. Opposed or juxtaposed to this chief afraid that because of the way that their chief executive is interpreting his role in the government, that he is in danger of somehow weakening some of the fabric and the traditions and the history of that government. That he was not ill-intentioned, but simply uninformed about the relationship between his role and the role of those deemed to legislate in the name of the people. You have in a third element an increasingly vocal, increasingly raucous, and energetic fourth estate, a press, who began to insert themselves into that process. The dynamic between those groups set up a period of controversy that will last for almost 50 years and result in a principle that has become one of the bedrocks by which, in the past 70 years especially, one of the hallmarks of a free and democratic society can be defined worldwide. So the events and the people I'm going to talk about now aren't specifically related to U.S. history or to the history of Britain, but instead I think it's lessons from another time of a world that may look very familiar. So we talk now about Wilkes and liberty. The year that I've been describing is 1763. The place is England. The executive is a very young king, George III. Yes, please. This is his coronation portrait, which was made by one of the most famous artists of the day at the time of his coronation in 1760. He is an unusual figure in England's history. He is the third of what is called the Hanoverian line, which had inherited the throne from the remnants of the very infamous and exciting Stuarts, who had managed to get one king executed. And it was all great fun, was had by all. We're not going to worry about him. George III was unique for several reasons. One, he was the first of the Hanoverians to actually speak English. George I, who had taken the throne early in the 18th century, was a cousin who had basically come to replace the childless last Stuart monarch, and was chosen primarily because he did not speak English and thus would not interfere with Parliament in their ruling of the country. It works very well when your chief executive doesn't speak the native language. That way you can pretty much ignore him and do whatever you want. In this case, George I completely agreed because he thought that England had a terrible climate, the food was atrocious, and the women were ugly, and the hunting was better in Hanover. So he preferred to spend his entire reign in Hanover, where he was an elector within the Holy Roman Empire of one of the smaller Protestant states. His son, George II, also did not speak English, therefore could not and did not play his role in the constitutional process that the English had established after the English Civil War. He preferred to spend his time in Hanover, where the hunting was better, the food was better, the climate was better, and he didn't have to deal with all those English people. Parliament, once again, was left to its own devices, which made them perfectly happy because they could legislate like crazy, and did. George III is different. He was born in Britain. He was born in England. His first language was English, and he was taught by a succession of tutors, T-U-T-O-R-S in this case, not D-O-R-S, who basically had their own visions of the role that the king should play in a constitutional monarchy that England had become after the English Civil War of the 1640s and after the Glorious Revolution that had taken place in 1688 and 89. That constitutional monarchy established firmly through its own version of a Bill of Rights that there are limits on the powers of a king, and that the one body who is most important in limiting those powers is the legislative branch of the government, with two houses, a bicameral legislature, one elected by the people, using the phrase loosely because the English had very strict property qualifications on the right to vote and the right to sit as a member of the House of Commons. The second of the two houses is the House of Lords, which is a hereditary house. But together, the two of those houses, through history and through precedent, had developed a very close consultative and, in fact, lawmaking relationship with the monarchy. They had had free run of the place while George I and George II were king. George III was raised to assume that he needed to play his proper constitutional role in this system of checks and balances. Thus, Parliament no longer has sway. The problem is, of course, that the king is young, he is brash, he is relatively unschooled in the machinations of Parliament. They're a bunch of scoundrels, but they're so elegant and good at it, you can't help but like them most of the time. And so he comes bounding in as this young king prepared to take his place, which is read correctly by the parliamentary ascendancy as challenging them for powers that they now have held for the entire 18th century. How well do you think this is going to go? Go very well. So, there we have two of our players now on the stage. The Parliament determined to protect the powers that it has amassed because of an absent executive, and the executive determined to play his proper role in this mixed form of government. Now let's add something even more fun. Let's add in some new political ideas which have begun circulating in Europe and in parts of Great Britain, especially in Scotland, beginning in the 1640s and 50s. These ideas were related to two factors taking place more specifically in Britain than anywhere else in Europe at the time. Industrial change. Britain is undergoing a rapid transformation of its economic base from being primarily a rural, regionally based economy to being a world economy, fueled by carefully chosen colonies established primarily in the Western Hemisphere and meant to be a mercantile economy in which proper organization would mean that monopolies established by companies, whether they were joint stock companies, an invention borrowed from the Dutch, or crown companies sponsored directly by the executive and by the government itself, were ultimately supposed to make money for their investors. That's the joy of a joint stock company. You get more investors because you're selling shares of things. Sounding familiar? This is the beginnings of capitalism as it will develop. So you have this changing economic base from being largely rural, post-medieval economy based on regional markets, relatively small scale, to the British, as they're now starting to think of themselves, becoming a player on the world stage. So you have a young king, a parliament used to getting its way, and that parliament, by the way, is very supportive of this new economy. And you've got these colonies that are growing more and more self-sufficient, more and more profitable, and are beginning to get the wild, crazy idea that perhaps they too, as subjects of an English king living under a British and English parliament, and they're making a lot of money for these people, that they too should have a say and role in the policies governing the empire as it was emerging by the 1740s and 50s and 60s. And then it gets better. During the Tudor period, specifically just before the famous English Reformation began, which was entirely a result of Henry VIII's chromosomes, there had been a long-standing medieval group and medieval practice that had risen out of medieval law that had very carefully protected the monarch and the government that he or she headed from any kind of dissent, sedition, or other protest from the people, the rabble, those lucky enough to be governed by us. The original conception of control of public opinion in Britain had taken several forms. One of those forms is directly related to what I'm going to talk about this evening, so I'll leave some of the more interesting ones aside for now. Censorship of opinion and the expression and how that opinion could be expressed uh, lawfully or unlawfully. How far is too far in the expression of disagreement with the government and its principles? In the 1640s, as the English Civil War was beginning, of spec, no, actually, yeah, no, in the 1520s, I almost skipped a century. It can happen. In the 1520s, just before Henry VIII will break with the Catholic Church, he had become very concerned as the second Tudor monarch, and he wasn't terribly popular, by the way. The Tudors are a bunch of outsiders who've come to, they're not real kings. We don't like them. Had begun using a chamber called the Star Chamber, and specifically a very strict ordinance that allowed basically the crown, representing the government, the right to preview any publications or any expressions of discontent or concern about governmental policies. The justification for the use of what came to be known as the Star Chamber as a means to basically review and evaluate any sorts of public expressions of opposition to government policies was made on the basis of national security. This becomes extremely important as of 1534, when Henry will leave the Catholic Church in order to marry Anne Boleyn so that he can have another daughter, who of course becomes Elizabeth Regina, Elizabeth I, Elizabeth Rex. Let's see. How does this work? The Star Chamber is, in essence, a secret court made up of some of the chief ministers of the crown, made up of some of the judges of what was called the King's Bench courts, to evaluate the words and evaluate the best way to put it, positions of those who might be in opposition to the king and the crown and their policies. They met in secret. Their evaluations had a binding force of law. interested in warmer climates and better food than they already had access to. There also were conflicts taking place with some of the trade routes from the East Indies Company, the Dutch, and also the Portuguese, who still held a significant number of holdings, especially in coastal Africa. And the prize of all prizes, French colonial presence in India, the Raj, as it was coming to be called. The British saw no reason why they shouldn't have their fair share of some, most, or all of the above. And the 7 Years' War was another piece of their ability to start adding bit by bit to this empire. George III came to the throne determined to increase those holdings, as it would be his duty as the monarch of Britain. And the peace treaty that his government will negotiate is very, very harsh in some respects, related to some of England's adversaries, but was very, very lenient on the French. And y'all are going, you are going to get to the point someday, aren't you? This is all deep background. So here we go. The peace treaty ultimately, as a student of American history will know, is going to lead to the next war. In this case, the next war is going to be the American War for Independence, because the British, as a way of securing a peace treaty that will give them a large piece of the trade with India, and will give them all of what will become British North America, Canada, all of it, will agree that the French and their allies in the 7 Years' War will gain some protections. Specifically, American settlers will not be allowed to settle beyond a proclamation line established along the chain of the Appalachians. They will not be allowed to begin expanding any of the existing colonies into this new land. They had a great deal of population and land pressure in the American, original British American colonies, and they had contributed regiments, taken out loans, and have provided what we call basically both land and treasure to fighting this war, and now they find they are to be basically banned from any of the spoils. The Americans are less than happy. Why did the British agree to this concession to the hated French? It's a scandal. It's an outrage. Members of Parliament vehemently opposed this provision of the Treaty of Paris. The Americans vehemently opposed this provision of the Treaty of Paris, establishing the proclamation line of 1763. And there is a segment of the British Parliament that also is very suspicious of this decision and angry. They will begin using their skills as pamphleteers to start issuing scathing criticisms of the young king, saying that he has been misled by his ministers. He's too young to understand what he's doing. He has no experience in government, and he's let his ministers negotiate a crappy treaty. Excuse the language, but there's no way around it. The pamphleteers are careful to say that this isn't the king's fault. He's being misled by his ministers. This is enough to get most of the publications past the stationers. They aren't saying the king's an idiot. They're saying that the king is being misled by idiots. And they just want to inform him that, he's being misled, and they will help him come up with a better treaty. It's not him. It's his ministers who are at fault. There is one group, though, of pro-crown journalists, as they're starting to sometimes call themselves, because they are writing journals of their thoughts and publishing them. And one of those starts a paper called The Briton that says that any patriotic Englishman who loves his king and loves his country and loves empire must support the decisions of the government no matter what. That in the interest of national security, we should assume that the executive, the king, and his ministers negotiating this treaty have a good reason And that reason is for the betterment of the nation as a whole. And anyone who questions that is basically guilty of disloyalty at the least, sedition at the worst. One member of Parliament named John Wilkes decided that that was, first of all, complete hooey, because he was in the opposing parliamentary faction who believed that, frankly, the treaty was a disaster for the American colonists and a disaster for England because it was giving away some of these valuable pieces of real estate and protecting them from British settlement. He will, in reply to one of these pro-government papers, which makes it through the stationer's department every single week without anyone complaining a bit. When you're saying the government's perfect, you should listen to them, and anyone who doesn't believe what the government says is being a stupid ninny. Publish. John Wilkes says no, and he applies for permission to start a rival publication that he will call the North Briton. Next slide. We've seen enough with George. Wilkes then is going to become an unlikely champion in the rest of my tale, and believe it or not, now we're going to move fairly quickly. Wilkes is a member of Parliament. He is a member of this group within Parliament who believe that one of the hallmarks of a constitutional form of government is that this government is composed of bodies who act as checks and balances on one another, that each have distinct duties and responsibilities that automatically serve as limits on the excesses and silliness of the other branches. If Parliament is being silly, Wilkes does not argue that it is the King's role to basically challenge and check them. If the King is being silly, or if his appointed ministers are being silly, then it is the obligation of the legislative body, as representing the people in the social contract that is a monarchical and constitutionally viable form of government, to check the powers of the executive. The courts stand as the third group to sort out the difference when those differences arise. Without any one of these three groups, you cannot have a functioning government that is representative of the power of tradition and majesty and the voice of the people. A contract between the people and their rulers, that you will rule in our best interest, and if we don't think you are, we have the right to say something about that. We'll say it as nicely as we can, when we can, but we do have that right, and it is a contract, it's a business relationship under which these rules must exist. You cannot have a Louis XIV style France, an absolutist state where a king can waltz around and say, I am the state, and have everything bow to his will. That is not the way the English have chosen. That's not how and why the Civil War had been fought that had executed a king. It is not how John Wilkes had written, or John Locke in this case. Lots of Johns in English history. John Locke had written the two treatises on government to defend Parliament's right to fire a king who was being stupid in the 1680s that had led to the establishment of the English Bill of Rights. And it certainly isn't going to be George III who comes waltzing in, the first king to even speak English in almost 60 years, and start trying to run the government as if he's Louis XIV. We're not having it. And Wilkes is a member of the House of Commons who says we're not having it. The North Briton will take its name as a poke at one of the king's tutors when he was growing up, and who had become his chief minister, and who was in charge of the treaty negotiations to end the 7 Years' War. His name is Lord Bute, and he's a Scottish laird. And a North Briton is pejorative slang for a Scotsman. The Scots call the English far worse things, and I won't sully your ears by telling you what they are, but they're mean about them, the English, because they're just silly Southerners. They're just idiots. So, the North Britain was established to basically call the king on the negotiations of the conduct of his government generally. But more especially, the focus over the weeks of publication will come to be on the king's diplomatic activities related to this peace treaty ending the French and Indian or the 7 Years' War. What finally will do it, and Wilkes makes it for the most part through the Stationers' Company, using a combination of this sort of disguised narrative of stories each week, saying that the king, he's completely loyal to King, but wonders if perhaps his ministers might not be leading him correctly. He's more or less careful until he gets to the point where the king, having now a finished peace agreement, makes a speech explaining to Parliament as only George III, who believed that he should be basically unquestioned, could do it. He tells Parliament, here's your treaty. It's not negotiable. It is my will. We're done. We will not allow the Americans to settle past the proclamation line. We are ceding territory to Spain in return for this concession from the French. We're done. And anyone who dares question that is ultimately guilty of ill will toward me and toward the nation. Wilkes has had it. Had it. The North Britain 45 is the famous one. The 45 is a scathing attack on the king's speech, saying, up to now I've been willing, I'm paraphrasing, Wilkes is much better. He's like blistering. He says, up to now I've been willing to believe that the king is young and has been misled by his Scottish ministers. I've been willing to believe that he would grow into his role and begin to see that protection of commerce, the protection of our colonial subjects is just as important as some of the wider objectives that he posits to support. I now have incontrovertible proof that the man's an idiot. And that's more or less the tone it will take. He's smart enough, though, as he has been throughout the entirety of publication of issues 1 through 44, been careful not to name himself. So, how on earth is the Stationers' Company going to come after him? They don't know who wrote it. Further, he uses different of the commercial book printers to publish each week, and sometimes supplements with literally a press he kept in his attic, so that basically they also can't get him. They can't get whoever published it because they aren't sure, because the publisher